Plant and pollinator coevolution. Evolution is the process by which species experience gradual changes over many generations. Coevolution is when interacting species experience reciprocal evolutionary changes. In other words, the evolution of one species is driving the evolution of another species. Generally, the relationship between plants and pollinators is considered to be mutualism, as both parties receive benefits. Animal pollinators can receive food and a protection from the plant, and the plant is able to spread its pollen and be pollinated by the animal. It has been widely accepted that evolution of both plants and pollinators has been driven, at least in part, by the species interaction. To what degree its influence in evolution is driving diversification still remains uncertain. The idea of coevolution was first developed by Darwin in explaining the morphology observed in a plant and pollinator. To explain how coevolution shapes plants and pollinators, we can use the Malagasy orchid and hawk moth as an example. The Malagasy orchid has its nectar at the bottom of a long spur, so hawk moths would need to have a long proboscis in order to reach the food source. This means moths with the longest tongue are the most fit, creating directional selective force so that moths in each generation will have longer and longer tongues. The orchids only have pollen transfer if the moths push the base of their proboscis against the reproductive parts of the flower. This means the orchid needs to have a long enough spur so the moth is forced to press further into the flower and the base of its proboscis makes contact. Orchids with spurs that are shorter than the tongues of the moths that visit it would not be effectively pollinated because the moth would not have made enough contact with its reproductive parts, meaning the orchids with the longest spurs would be the fittest. Due to the directional selection, each generation of orchid would evolve a longer and longer spur. This then drives the directional selection in moths, and each generation of moth would have to develop a longer and longer tongue. This relationship very clearly illustrates the coevolution between plants and pollinators. As one species adapts, the other responds, pushing the force of directional selection, which facilitates the reciprocal evolution between plant and pollinator. Coevolution isn't the only evolutionary force acting on plants and pollinators, though. There are still selective pressures which would oppose having such extreme traits. The hawk moth, for example, has an evolutionary constraint on how long their proboscis can be before it interferes with the moth's ability to fly. For the orchid, it takes more energy and resources to develop a long spur, so that the cost and the amount of resources spent on developing a long spur might outweigh the benefit of having a greater level of pollination. One-sided evolutionary forces can act in opposition to the selection facilitated by coevolution, preventing coevolution from driving traits too far to the extreme. So while plants and pollinators are observed to be co-evolving, the strength of this evolutionary force depends on the species involved. How much coevolution influences diversification is still debated, but it is suggested that plant diversification has been stimulated by the interactions with pollinators, though the diversification of flowering plants has not been shown to have caused an increase in higher taxa in pollinating insects. But it is well supported that species-level adaptive radiation of some pollinating insect groups has occurred following the expansion of angiosperm fertile niches. Coevolution is observed between generous plants and pollinators, but is the strongest between plants and pollinators which have mutually obligate relationships or one-to-one relationships. We are actually fortunate enough to have exclusive interviews with some plants and pollinators about their relationship and coevolution, starting with the yucca and yucca moth. So, tell me about yourself. What do you normally do in a lifetime?
Well, for the majority of my short life, I'm in my larval stage eating rotten yucca fruit or underground in my winter cocoon. However, in the spring, I emerge above ground and find a mate. This is where the yucca plant comes in. Yippee! When it's time for me to lay my eggs, I find a few suitable yucca flowers. I gather pollen from a few, scraping them into a big lump with my legs.
Ouch.
Then I find a flower that hasn't already been used by another yucca moth to lay her eggs. Once I find one, I use my ovipositor to burrow through the ovary wall and I lay my eggs next to the flower's ovules. I can't lay too many, however, or else the flower will die.
As I should.
Then I go back and pollinate the flower by depositing the pollen ball on the flower's stigma.
I will then produce enough seeds and fruit to feed the moth's larvae until they grow big enough to drop the ground, where they burrow and make their cocoons. Whenever that happens, it always feels like a huge weight has been lifted from my shoulders.
Hey,
What do you like about each other? And what is special about your relationship?
Not to toot my own horn, but I provide an amazingly sheltered environment where her children can grow up safely and protected from outside dangers, such as harsh weather or predators. I also provide foods dense in sugars and nutrients for the growing larvae.
well, I do something good for you too. I work hard to pollinate you guys and make sure that you consistently have future generations.
Well, I guess.
Is there any part of your relationship with the other that is particularly difficult for you or you find yourself worried about?
Well, I guess I have to be careful when laying my eggs. If my ovipositor is too long, I can end up poking too far and damaging the flower's ovules. That would be good for no one, since I wouldn't get the fruit to feed my larva and she doesn't get to produce any viable offspring. I also have to be careful not to lay too many eggs or it might overwhelm the flower, causing it to abort. Kind of annoying that I can't just do whatever I want to ensure my survival only.
Well, I need to make sure I produce enough seeds to make sure that I still have some offspring in the end, even after her children have eaten their fill. It really takes up a lot of energy, you know. Seeds aren't cheap.
But if I produce less offspring, it decreases the chance that at least some of my children will make it to adulthood.
Well, it seems like you've been doing just fine for the past 6.5 million years since we've known each other.
Oh yeah, remember when we got separated from our sister plants and moths when the estuarine started running through the Navajo desert?
I sure do. That caused us to speciate allopatrically because we were isolated on opposite sides of the river and we had no choice but to learn to live with each other.
I just love correlated divergence and coevolution due to force proximity.
What's the way you've changed your behavior for each other?
Well, on top of the eggs, our handy abortion mechanism is what's really been affecting the moth's clutch number. It's been proposed that we yuccas originally developed the abortion mechanism so that we can selectively abort low-quality fruit. As you can see, this has helped drive this aspect of our coevolution.
Yeah, it became a challenge because someone could lay all these eggs and it would be for nothing because whatever pollen they happened to put on wasn't good enough for the flowers. So she would abort the flower along with all the offspring. I mean, if I provide high-quality pollen, it decreases my chances that the flower I oviposited to will get aborted. So it really pushed my ancestors to develop this active pollination we have now. It also encourages us to lay our eggs conscientiously, so if the flower rejects the pollen, we don't lose everything.
Well, thank you for talking about your guys' relationship and coevolution.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Now for the Andean bellflower and white-tipped sicklebill. So who are you guys? Tell me a little bit about your lives.
Hey, I'm the white-tipped sicklebill. Before we get started here, I want to give a shout out to my friend by parapatric speciation, the buff-tailed sicklebill. So glad we don't share a genus anymore. Anyways, I live in Costa Rica, but a bunch of my cousins live in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. I spend my days zipping from place to place, constantly eating to keep up with my speedy metabolism. I particularly love to eat nectar. My friend here is great for that. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm the Centrifugon granulosus. I'm beautiful and pink and totally specialized for the white-tipped sicklebill and her friend, but we don't talk about that.
What do you guys like about each other? What is special about your relationship?
I like the beak of my hummingbird friend. It's so perfectly specialized for my own anatomy.
Yes, while other pollinators may have trouble reaching granulosus's nectar, my beak has evolved to the perfect shape to reach down the stamen.
In return, you get some of my pollen attached to your wings and beak. That means I have to do less work getting it out there and making for some pretty awesome gene flow.
Well, I just have to mention how gorgeous my friend here is. Beautiful pink, red, and yellow, some of my favorites. Not to say I'm awesome or anything, but I totally have 4 types of cones in my eyes, while the interviewer over there has only 3 types of cones. Bet you wish you could see UV light, huh?
I can't really do that. Anyways, how have you guys impacted each other's livelihood?
Well, I certainly had to change the way I ate nectar from flowers. Even though the shape of my beak is perfectly suited for my friend here, it's not easy to carry around a beak as big as this. When I fly up to a flower, I start a little below the corolla. I tilt my head up backwards, allowing the front of my beak in. I then tilt my head forwards, allowing the rest of my beak to navigate the flower, and all of the nectar is mine.
Speaking of nectar, I have a behavior of my own that I changed. Well, I can't take all the credit. I saw a bunch of other flowers doing it, and I thought I might as well try. See, the hummingbirds aren't the only pollinators around, you know. I took a bit of fondness to them and made nectar that is rich in sucrose, just the way they like it. I also made sure that I was scentless, since the bees seem to like it, and those guys give me the creeps.
Well, thank you guys for talking about your relationship and like how you've changed for each other.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you!
Coevolution, while widely accepted, is difficult to disentangle from other evolutionary forces. However, these relationships between plants and pollinators have really shown us how their interactions push each other to attain and maintain certain characteristics. Plants and pollinators have really come to rely on each other, which provides this bond that facilitates reciprocal evolution. Selective pressures have shaped the morphology, scent, nectar production, and other aspects of plants, so they are best suited for their associated animal pollinators. While the impact of coevolution on diversification does differ drastically depending on the pollinator and plant, one thing is certain: the interaction and dependence between pollinators and plants has fostered coevolution.